Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bert Barnett. I'm one of the National Park Rangers here at Gettysburg, and I'd like to welcome you to the musical occurrence that's going to begin here in just a few moments. Ryan and his merry band of minstrels, I don't know your proper name here at this point, so I just went ahead and forged, represent a rather unique blend of two elements that Victorian America was very much familiar with, and that was poetry and music. And I'll give you a little bit of background on the poetry end of it, since I gather most of you have been charmed with the music here for a little bit of it. In the era of the Civil War and earlier, and a little bit later as well, writings by participants and witnesses to the Battle of Gettysburg and the American Civil War were very much a part of what went on and existed at the time. And it still is one of the most powerful artifacts that we have of that time. It still speaks to us today, far beyond the military and technical aspects of the combat. Often after, but in rare cases during critical moments, some given to writing attempted to record their experiences. Journals, diaries, letters, and newspapers all provide excellent insights as to how the people of the time felt about the great events that they had seen, and how strongly they communicated those sentiments. The shock and stress on all touched by the conflict was tremendous. Great and weak pens alike participated in these attempts at expression. One form of articulation, less common now than then, was the poem. Produced and enjoyed by persons of all economic and educational backgrounds, poetry flourished during the era. Not merely filler for greeting cards, as today, poetry was employed in diverse ways, some of them quite powerful. In an age when newspaper was frequently a patchwork of serial dramatic stories, a few real news items, and perhaps an editorial cartoon, the editor's most powerful tool was often his verse, frequently employed to highlight his views. It's a luxury of owning a newspaper, always has, always will be. In the decades during the debates over abolition, poets supporting emancipation crafted a multitude of partisan pieces to carry their views forward. Opponents did likewise with theirs. Once the conflict erupted, countless inspiring and nationalistic compositions were produced by poets of both sides, expressing the war fever that then consumed many. In this sense, verse performed many of the same functions as it had during the pre-war era, with the additional responsibilities of patriotic nation building at work in the South once the war commenced. At all points, sacrifices had to be justified, leaders had to be praised or mourned, and occasionally mocked. And at the end of it all, victory and defeat had to be encountered. Ultimately, if we hope to repair ourselves as a nation, remembrance as well as reconciliation on many levels needed to take place. In all these activities, poetry, as well as music, played an important role. Robert E. Lee once stated, "I don't believe we can have an army without music." He was aware of the emotional role that those elements played in the success of keeping an army in the field. It served to remind them who they were and what they were fighting for. In the North and the South, both at the field and at the fireside, poetry likewise provided patriotic inspiration for the cause. Just as importantly, it also served as a calming connection between the stresses of the literal world and the lyrical sensibilities of Victorian America. It was at once both instruction and distraction. In 1866, William Gilmore Simms, pre-war editor of the Southern Literary Messenger, and perhaps the preeminent Southern poet of the day, whose South Carolina home woodlands and 10,000-volume library had perished during the war, noted in his preface to his work, Southern Poetry of the War, he noted a basic truth regarding the value of historic poetry. He observed, "The emotional literature of a people is as necessary to the philosophical historian as the mere details of events in the progress of a nation. The mere facts of a history do not always or often indicate the true animus of the action. But in poetry, the emotional nature, you get that, the emotional nature is apt to declare itself without reserve, speaking out with a passion that disdains the subterfuge, and through media of imagination and fancy, which glows or weeps with emotions that gush freely and freshly from the heart. Now that's a powerful vision right there. The same truth might have come well from Oliver Wendell Holmes or Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Northern men possessed of entirely different political temperaments. It was the essential truth of that statement itself which makes the study of this poetry so necessary to a richer and more complete understanding of this complex period. For throughout history, celebrated moments in the life of tribes and nations have been captured in verse, destined to be repeated with pride by future generations as they recounted the past glories of their storied ancestors. The Iliad, Emerson's The Conquered Hymn, here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world, you may remember that. Thomson's The High Tide at Gettysburg, 1,000 fell where Kemper led, 1,000 died where Garnett led, are iconic titles of this type. Poetry breathes passion back into history. Gettysburg is recalled for two things, a 3-day battle and a 2-minute speech. The battle has been retold endlessly in many forms. It is the source of numberless poems as well. The Gettysburg Address, crafted and delivered by a poet, yes, Lincoln was a poet, reflects many poetic qualities. Creative description, repetition, and alliteration are all powerful poetic techniques used well by Abe Lincoln. Many soldiers who sleep within sight of the Soldiers' National Monument were likewise poets themselves and expressed themselves through that medium. We know of some of their works. In an odd twist of fate and an ironic honor of sorts to the poet, they, and now all American soldiers resting in the National Cemetery, are guarded by plaques containing verses from Kentucky poet Theodore O'Hara's The Bivouac of the Dead, originally written in 1847 to honor his state's fallen at the Battle of Buena Vista during the Mexican War. Oddly enough, being a Kentuckian, O'Hara went to the Confederate side and wound up being a colonel in the Confederate Army and an aide to a Confederate general. Due perhaps to his Confederate associations, you'll never see his name on any of those cemetery plaques, but doubtless you'll remember these words when you read them. On fame's eternal camping ground, their silent tents are spread, and glory guards with solemn round the bivouac of the dead. That's powerful stuff. It doesn't say this side, that side, we won, they lost. It just speaks to what the soldiers did here. Upon the hallowed fields, inscribed on their select monuments, in their newspapers, even through daily correspondences, rhyme and poetry were a portion of the atmospherics that the people of the 1860s used to connect the timeless values of the past with their present. Many who witnessed that war era sought refuge in a precise language keyed into the imaginations yet unnumbed by the modern disruptions of progress. This allowed simple arrangements of verse to deliver messages both powerful and tender, which reflect the turmoil of that time. Unfortunately, poetry of this sort and music of that time evoke powerful imagery, but it is no longer widely heard. Our once widely understood poetic culture has become a casualty of the computer chip, miniaturization, and niche marketing, and is now nearly lost. That's what makes assemblies like this all the more special. To survive, it requires understanding, appreciation, and support. Once recaptured and shared, we may enhance our comprehension of who we have been and who we may yet aspire to be. It is a part of our collective cultural heritage. I'm impressed by the turnout, and I trust that you will enjoy the gifts that Ryan and his crew have brought to us today. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Bert. Thank you for that beautiful speech. And thank everyone for being here this afternoon. It's a little warm. I'm glad the rain cleared. My name is Ryan Maslick. We're honored to be here at Gettysburg to give to you the very first performance of this show here at Gettysburg National Military Park. Visited the park in 2018, and downtown there was a great bookstore for the historian. Get a chance to visit if you have time. And I saw a book on the shelf, Poetry of the Civil War. I was so inspired and moved from my first visit here. I wanted to do something musical to express that appreciation and awesomeness of this ground. So this show, what we're going to sing for you today, is all of the words have been written by either soldiers or people alive during the Civil War. There's one song written by a woman that was written a few years after the war, which is the closing song, the title of the show, Marching Still. All the music's been composed. I've tried to write the songs. What would the poem have sounded like if it was written in 1860s America? So we hope to do that justice. So with that, thank you for being here for Marching Still. I'd like to introduce our flute and piccolo player today, Brent. And I'd like to introduce now our soprano for the show, Erin Norley. Yeah, don't forget your water. This poem, the first poem we're going to sing for you, is titled The 1037, written by Private Miles O'Reilly. 3 years ago today, we raised our hands to heaven, and on the rolls of muster, our names were 37. There were just 1,000 bayonets, and the swords were 37, as we took our oath of service, with our right hands raised to heaven. Oh, it was a gallant day, memory still adored, that day of our sunbright nuptials, with the musket and the sword. Shrill rang the fifes, the bugles bled, beneath the cloudless heaven. Twinkled 1,000 bayonets, and the swords were 37. Of 1,000 stalwart bayonets, 200 marched today. Hundreds lie in Virginia's swamps, others in Maryland to play, and other hundreds less happy drag their mangled limbs around, and envy the deep, long, blessed sleep of the battlefield's holy ground. For the swords one night a week ago, the remnant just 11, gathered around a banqueting board with seats for 37. There were 2 came in on crutches, and 2 had each one a hand, to pour the wine and raise the cup as we toasted our flag and land. And the room seemed filled with whispers as we looked at the vacant seats, and with choking throats we pushed aside the rich but untasting meats. Then in silence we pinned our glasses as we rose up just 11, and we bowed as we drank to the loved and the dead who had made us 37. And we bowed as we drank to the loved and the dead who had made us 37. The name of this next poem is titled The Lone Sentry. It tells the story of a sentry by himself in the army on a campground at night, watching over the camp, written by James Ryder Randall. "'Twas in the dying of the day, the darkness grew so still, the drowsy pipe of evening birds was hushed upon the hill. Athwart the shadows of the vale slumbered the men of might, and one lone sentry placed his rounds to watch the camp that night. A grave and solemn man was he, with deep and somber brow. The dreamful eyes seemed boarding up some unaccomplished brow. A wistful glance peered o'er the plains beneath the starry light, and with the murmured name of God he watched the camp that night. The future opened unto him its grand and awful scroll. Manassas and the Valley March came heaving for his soul. Richmond and Sharpsburg thundered by with that tremendous fight, which gave him to the angel host who watched the camp that night. We mourn for him who died for us with one resistless moan, while in the valley of the Lord he marches to the throne. He kept the faith of men and saints, sublime and pure and bright. He sleeps and all is well with him who watched the camp that night. Brothers, the midnight of the cause is shrouded in our fate. The demon gods pollute our halls with fire and lust and hate. Be strong, be valiant, be assured. Strike home for heaven and right. The soul of Jackson stalks abroad and guards the camp tonight. Oh, the soul of Jackson stalks abroad and guards the camp tonight. This next poem is titled He'll See It When He Wakes. About a soldier not getting a letter from his loved one in time before he's sent off in prison in a camp. And what we're going to do first is play, if the melody, I'd imagine if the melody had been a song with the words, but we're going to do a prelude to that as if it were a military march, and Bryn's going to play that on the piccolo. Amid the clouds of battle smoke, the sun had died away, and where the storm of battle broke, 1,000 warriors lay. A band of friends upon the field stood round a youthful form, who when the war clouds thunder pealed had perished in the storm. Upon his forehead, on his hair, the coming moonlight breaks, and each dear brother standing there a tender farewell takes. But ere they laid him in his home, there came a comrade near and gave a token that had come from her, the dead held dear. A moment's doubt upon the breast, the one the letter takes. He lays it low upon his breast, he'll see it when he wakes. O thou who dost in sorrow wait, whose my dear message came too late. He'll see it when he wakes. No more amid the fiery storm shall his strong arm be seen. No more his young and manly form press Mississippi's green. And even thy tender words of love, the words affection speaks, came all too late, but oh my love, you'll see him when he wakes. No sound disturbs his gentle rest, no noise his slumber will break. But thy words sleep upon his breast, he'll see them when he wakes. But thy words sleep upon his breast, he'll see them when he wakes. Thank you. I've just sweated out that much. This next poem tells the story of a general. Boys rallying around, following their general in the battle. Very proud, starting off very proud, and daring to go wherever he goes. And the general has an unfortunate outcome, a result of this battle, as you'll hear in the beautiful words of this poem. I think every single one of these poems, every word is so poignant and precious. So here is The General's Death, written by Joseph O'Connor. The general dashed along the road amid the pelting rain. How joyously his bold face glowed to hear our cheers refrain. His blue blouse flapped in wind and wet, his boots were splashed with fire. Around his lips a smile was set, and in his eyes a fire. A laughing word, a gesture kind, we did not ask for more. 30 weary miles behind, a weary fight before. The gun grew light to every man, the cross belts ceased their stress. As onward to the columns van, we watched our leader pass. We saw him lie, a bullet in his brain. His manly face turned to the sky, beaten by the rain. face turned to the sky, beaten by the rain, beaten by the rain, beaten by the rain. Our next poem comes from the origin of Memorial Day, laying flowers and laurels on graves of the dead, the beautiful tradition titled "The Blue and the Gray." Of all the poems today, this one in particular really separates the division, North and South, Union, Confederacy, brother to brother and family to family, honoring those who gave their lives, who died on both sides, and the sacrifice that gives. This is "The Blue and the Gray" by Francis Miles Finch. By the flow of the inland river, whence the fleets of iron fled, where the blades of the grave grass quiver, asleep are the ranks of the dead. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day. Under the one, the blue, under the other, the gray.
These in the robings of glory, those in the gloom of defeat, all with the battle blood gory, the dusk of eternity meet. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day. Under the laurel, the blue, under the willow, the gray.
From the silence of sorrowful hours, the desolate mourners go, lovingly laden with flowers, alike for the friend and the foe.
Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day. Under the roses, the blue, under the lilies, the gray. So with an equal splendor, the morning sun rays fall, with a touch impartially tender on the blossoms blooming for all. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day. Broidered with gold the blue, mellowed with gold the gray.
So when the summer calleth on forest and field of grain, with an equal murmur falleth the cooling drip of the rain. Under the sun and the dew, waiting the judgment day, wet with the rain, the blue, wet with the rain, the gray. Sadly, but not with upbraiding, the generous deed was done. In the storm of the years that are fading, the braver battle was won. Under the sun and the dew, waiting the judgment day, under the blossoms the blue, under the garlands the gray. No more shall the war cry sever, or the winding rivers be red. They banish our anger forever when they roar the graves of the dead. Under the sun and the dew, waiting the judgment day, love and tears for the blue, tears and love for the gray. Thank you. Our next poem, titled Dirge for a Soldier, Lay Him Low, written by George Henry Boker. Well, I think in terms of environment, this gives us a feel for what... This poem tells a story of a young boy found on probably sometime shortly after a battle, lost his life on the field, and something that they would do, finding the dead on the ground. And this poem tells a story of that process. Lay him low.
Close his eyes, his work is done. What to him is friend or foeman, rise of moon or set of sun, hand of man or kiss of day he fought his fight, proved his truth by his endeavor. Let him sleep in solemn night, sleep forever and forever. Lay him low, lay him low, in the clover or the snow. What cares he? He cannot know. Lay him low, lay him low. Fold him in his country stars, roll the drum and fire the volley. What to him are all our wars? What but death be mocking folly? Lay him low, lay him low, in the clover or the snow. What cares he? He cannot know. Lay him low, lay him low. Leave him to God's watching eye. Trust him to the hand that made him. Mortal love weeps idly by. God alone has power to aid him. Lay him low, lay him low, in the clover or the snow. What cares he? He cannot know. Lay him low, lay him low. What cares he? He cannot know. Lay him low, lay him low.
Thank you. Just a couple more poems for you today. This one is titled Send Them Home Tenderly, and the author is unknown. This will feature our soprano, Erin Norley, telling the story of a very touching farewell poem of sending home the dead back to their homes. And the absolute privilege and honor to be able to share these words from so long ago with all of you here on this beautiful ground.
Send them
Karen's going to read for us now a little short story before our final poem today, and a letter included in this story that takes place right here in Gettysburg on the battlefield.
Before enlisting as a private in Company G of the 68th Pennsylvania in August 1862, 23-year-old Peter Hilt, or Hill according to some records, worked as a molder in Albany, New York, where he lived with his widowed mother, Sibylla, age 55. Unmarried and the only one of Sibylla's 5 children still residing at home, Peter contributed his $10 weekly earnings to the household, which his mother used for rent and necessities. While serving in the Union Army, Hilt sent most of his pay home to Sibylla, who, despite her age and physical infirmities, supplemented her son's contributions by cleaning several neighbors' homes. Late on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, the 68th, part of Major General Daniel Sickles' 3rd Corps, recognizable by the diamond patches soldier wore on their uniforms, was posted just south of Gettysburg in the Peach Orchard, where they would face the onslaught of General William Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade. During the fierce fighting, one of Hilt's thighs was shattered by a gunshot wound. Several comrades carried the suffering private to the nearby Jacob Schwartz farm and left him in a barn before returning to duty. Several days later, volunteer nurse Mary Morris' husband discovered Hilt in the barn and, as she later wrote to his mother, took an interest in him. The 42-year-old husband, a Philadelphia native and granddaughter of Declaration of Independence signer Robert Morris, had worked as a volunteer nurse for the Army of the Potomac at Harrison's Landing, Virginia, in the summer of 1862 following the Peninsula Campaign, and after the subsequent battles of Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. On July 3rd, upon hearing of the fighting at Gettysburg, husband again left her Philadelphia home to tend to the needs of her boys. She arrived on the field the following day and began working at the Schwartz farm, which served as the hospital for the 1st Division of the 3rd Corps. On July 17th, Peter Hilt died of his wounds. 1 month later, husband, by now back in Philadelphia, and herself suffering from a fever that she had contracted in the atmosphere of the Schwartz farm, sent the following letter to Sibylla. Mrs. Hill, my dear friend, I call you so because I was attached to your son. I have nothing of his but some hair. He probably lost everything on the battlefield. I took charge of some 300 wounded, principally rebels, in a barn, outhouses, etc., and under part of the barn. I spoke to your boy thinking of him a Confederate, but one of the rebels said, "Do try and get that fellow out of this place. He is badly wounded and one of your men." So I at once went and got some boys to help me and carefully moved him to the piazza of a house nearby. He told me about you and said he was anxious to get well on your account. So I became much interested in him and urged the surgeons to examine the wound, but they pronounced it hopeless. I was not satisfied, however, and the following day, Dr. Hayes, surgeon in charge of 1st Division Hospital, came over, and I got him to examine. He said there was hope, and if you could get him over to the hospital to operate on him. I got my boys to carry him on a stretcher, and Dr. Hayes operated himself, laying open the leg and removing the crushed pieces of bone. The leg was fractured too high up for amputation. I went to see him the next day, and he was doing nicely, everything favorable, and he was very grateful to me for accomplishing what I did, as well as getting him in more comfortable quarters. I promised to come and see him as often as possible, but was half a mile from him with a creek in between that rose rapidly and cut me off whenever it rained, so I did not see him but once afterward, still doing well. But the weather became warmer, and mortification set in. He died very easily. I heard, for I knew nothing of it until all was over, when one of the boys came to tell me, and I sent for some of his hair, not even having time to go and see him. You have no idea how hard we have to work after a battle. There are so many who need help and so few to give it that those who go as I do have scarce time to attend to individual cases or to remember them. But your son particularly interested me, and therefore I saved his hair for you. And knowing a mother's feelings, knew that you would like to have as much of an account as I can give you. But it is not much, but shows he did not die without an effort to save him, as alas, many of our brave boys do. He had comfortable food and good nursing during his last days, and you may yet obtain more particulars about him, as there were some of his own regiment in the same ward. God bless you and comfort you. Yours truly, Mary M. Husband. On September 22, 1863, Sibylla Hilt filed for a pension with the federal government, using as part of her evidence the above letter from Mary Husband. In March 1864, her pension request was granted, and she began receiving $8 a month, the maximum amount then allowed under the law. Today, the remains of Peter Hilt, the sole support of his widowed mother, lie in grave B48 of the Pennsylvania section of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Sibylla died in early 1894. By that time, her monthly government stipend had increased to $12. Husband managed to recover from her illness and returned to nursing with the Army in the winter of 1863, serving in assorted military hospitals for the rest of the war. She died in Philadelphia on March 3, 1894.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today and bracing the heat with us. I want to thank Pam back there, works for the park, for letting me come with my ensemble and do this first performance here of Marching Still at Gettysburg. It's a hope of mine that this will not be the last. We'll get to do this many times and share these beautiful words with visitors. This last poem was written a few years after the Civil War, the 1870s, by a woman named Minna Irving. And her words are perfection. They speak for themselves, so I'm not going to say much about it. She is old and bent and wrinkled in her rocker in the sun, and the thick gray woolen stocking that she knits is never done. She will ask the news of battle if you pass her when you will, for to her the troops are marching, marching still. 7 tall sons about her growing cheered the widowed mother's soul. One by one they kissed and left her when the drums began to roll. They are buried in the trenches, they are bleaching on the hill. For her
was knitting in the corner when the fatal news was read. How the last and youngest perished, and the letter ending said,
I am riding on my knapsack by the road with borrowed crew, for the Union armies marching soon.
Reason sank and died within her, for the flame for want of air. So she missed the warm stockings for the soldier lads to wear. Waiting till the war is ended, for her sons to cross the sill,
For she thinks they all are marching still. For she thinks they all are marching still. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all.